All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. We're still on Changing Economic Patterns, page 521. All right. The Bank of France acted as a kind of general staff for the 40 families which controlled the 19 chief private banks. Little effort was made to influence affairs by the rediscount rate, and open market operations were not used until 1938. The state was influenced by the Treasury's need for funds from the Bank of France. Other banks were influenced by methods more exclusively French, by marriage alliances, by indirect bribery, that is, by control of well-paying censures in banking and industry, and by the complete dependence of French banks on the Bank of France in any crisis. This last arose from the fact that the French banks did not emphasize gold reserves, but instead regarded commercial paper as their chief reserve. In any crisis where this paper could not be liquidated fast enough, the banks resorted to the unlimited note-issuing power of the Bank of France. In the third line of control of the French economy were the investment banks called banques d'affaires. These were dominated by two banks, the Banque de Paris et Pays Bas, set up by the Rothschild Group in 1872, and the Banque de Union Parisienne, founded by the rival bloc in 1904. These investment banks supplied long-term capital to industry and took stock and directorships in return. Much of the stock was resold to the public, but the directorships were held indefinitely for control purposes. In 1931, Paribas held the securities of 357 corporations, and its own directors and top managers held 180 directorships in 120 of the more important of these. The control was frequently made easier by the use of non-voting stock, multiple voting stock, co-optive directorships, and other refinements of financial capitalism. For example, the General Wireless Company, set up by Paribas, distributed 200,000 shares of stocks worth 500 francs a share. Of these, 181,000 shares sold to the public had 1/10 vote each, while 18,000 shares held by the insider group had 1 vote each. A similar situation was to be found in Havas stock, also issued by Paribas. The investment bank of the non-Jewish private banks and their industrial allies was the Union Parisienne. Among its 16 directors were to be found such names as Mirabaud, Hottinger, Neflis, Vernes, Wendell, Lubersac, and Schneider in the period before 1934. The two largest stockholders in 1935 to 1937 were Lubersac and Mellet. The directors of this bank held 124 other directorships on 90 important corporations in 1933. At the same time, it held stock in 338 corporations. The value of the stock held by the Union Parisienne in 1932 was 482.1 million francs, and of that held by Paribas, 548.8 million francs, giving a total for both 1,000 million francs. In the fourth line of control were 5 chief commercial banks with 4,000 branches in 1932. At the beginning of the century, these had all been within the Paribas consortium, But after the founding of the Union Parisine in 1904, they slowly drifted over to the new bloc, the Comptoir National Escompité, going over almost at once, with the others following more slowly. As a result, the control of the two great blocs over the great deposit banks was rather mixed during the 20th century, with the old Jewish group of private bankers losing ground rather steadily. The decline of this group was closely related to the decline of international financial capitalism and received its worst blow in the losses in foreign bonds resulting from the First World War. Regional deposit banks were controlled in varying degrees by one or the other of the two blocs, the Paribas control being stronger in the north, west, and south, while the Union Comité bloc was stronger in the northeast, east, and southeast. Control of savings banks and insurance companies was also shared, especially where they had been founded before the two blocs achieved their modern form. For example, the largest insurance company in France, with capital in reserves of 2,000 million francs in 1931, had as directors such names as Mallet, Rothschild, Nefles, Huttinger, and so on. So basically the same people. This cooperation between the two blocs in regard to the lower levels of the banking system and the Bank of France itself did not usually extend to industrial or commercial activity. There, competition outside the market was severe and became a struggle to the death in 1932 to 1940. In some activities, spheres of interest were drawn between the two groups, and thus competition was reduced. Inside France, there was the basic division between East and West, the Jewish group emphasizing shipbuilding, transatlantic communication and transportation, and public utilities in the West, while the Protestant Catholic group emphasized iron, steel, and armaments in the East. Outside France, the former group dominated the colonies, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean, while the latter group emphasized Central and Eastern Europe, chiefly through the European Industrial et Financière, created in 1920 to be the economic counterpart of the Little Entente. In some fields, the rivalry of the two groups had worldwide ramifications. In petroleum products, for example, the Jewish bankers, through the Banque de Paris de Paribas, controlled the Campagne Française de Pétroles, which was allied to Standard Oil and Rockefeller, while the Catholic Protestant bankers, through the Union Parisine, controlled Petrofina, which was allied to Royal Dutch Shell and Dietering. Jules X. Bryat, partner of Demachet de C, in which Francois de Wendel was majority owner, was a director of Union Parisine and Petrofina, and Alexander Bungener, partner at Lubersac at C, was also director of Union Parisine and of Petrofina. Charles Sargent, once Undersecretary of the Minister of Finance and Sub-Governor of the Bank of France, was for years chairman of the Union Parisine and played a role in one bloc similar to that played by Horace finally in the other bloc. He was a director of Petrofina and of Union Européenne Industrielle et Financière. When he retired for reasons of health in 1938, he was replaced in several positions, including Petrofina and Union Parisine, by John Tannery, honorary governor of the Bank of France. At the same time, Joseph Courcelle, former inspector of finances, was director of 17 companies, including Petrofina and Union Parisine. On the other side, Horace Finale was general manager of Paribas and director of Standard Franco-Americane, while his son Boris was a director of Francaise des Pétroles. Former ambassador Jules Cambon and Émile Odu, both directors of Paribas, were respectively directors of Standard Franco-American and Standard Française des Pétroles, before these merged in 1938. Outside the banking system, which we have sketched, the French economy was organized in a series of trade associations, industrial monopolies, and cartels. These were usually controlled by the Catholic Protestant bloc of private bankers, since the Jewish group continued to use the older methods of financial capitalism, while their rivals moved towards the more obvious methods of monopoly capitalism. In such cases, individual companies controlled by the Jewish group frequently joined the cartels and associations set up by the rival bloc. At the center of the system of monopolistic industrial controls was the Confédération Générale des Patronats Français, which after 1936 Matignon agreements did the collective bargaining for most French industry. The Confederation was divided into sections for different branches of industry. Around the Confederation was a series of general trade associations and cartels, such as the Comité des Forges, the Comité Central des Houilleurs, the Union des Industriels Metallurgies et Minerales, the Société des Industries Minérales, and so on. Below these were a large number of regional associations and local cartels. These were integrated into a single whole by financial controls, family alliances, and interlocking positions. In this system, the Comité des Forges, trade association of the metallurgical industry, held a key position. In France, the iron industry was originally widely scattered in small enterprises. Of these, the factories at Le Creusot, acquired by the Snyder family in 1838, were so favored by Napoleon III that they began to emerge as the chief metal company in France. As a result of the loss of governmental privileges by the shift from the Second Empire to the Third Republic, and the blow to Snyder's prestige from the victory of Krupp steel cannon over Le Creusot's bronze cannon in 1870, the whole metal industry of France began to turn towards monopoly and to seek capital from private bankers. The turn towards monopoly appeared almost at once, especially in the typical French form of the comptoir, a joint selling agency. In 1884, as we have said, the Comité des Forges was formed as an association of all the metallurgical industries of France, using a single comptoir to prevent price competition. By the 20th century, the Comité des Forges consisted of representatives of over 200 companies with a nominal capital of about 8 billion francs, but whose securities were worth almost 100 billion francs in 1939. Of the 200 corporations, the chief perhaps were Establishment Schneider, Les Forges des Aciéries des Marines et Homer Court, La Société des Petites Filles de François de Wendel, Les Aciéries de Longueuil, and so on. By the year 1939, 75% of French steel production was from 6 companies. The monopolistic influences, however, were much stronger than these figures would indicate. Of the 200 firms in the Comité des Forges, only 70 were of importance in iron and steel. These 70 had an aggregate capitalization of about 4 billion francs. Of these firms, 51 with 2 billion francs of capital in 1939 were the Union Committee bloc and were controlled by a Schneider-Mirabad alliance. 11 corporations with 506 million francs of capital were in the Paribas bloc. 8 firms with 749 million francs of capital were in neither bloc or doubtful. A somewhat similar development is to be found in the French coal industry. This perhaps is not surprising, as the coal industry was largely dominated by the same groups as the steel industry. By 1938, 77% of French coal production came from 14 companies. 3 of these companies were owned by Wendel, who thus controlled 15.3% of French coal output directly and considerably more indirectly. Parallel to the Comité des Forges and Steel, and controlled by the same group, was the Comité Central des Halures in Coal. This was supported by taxes on collieries based on output. Voting power within the organization was based on this financial contribution, so that 13 companies controlled over 3/4 of the votes and Wendel over 1/6. The French coal industry was controlled nearly as completely by the Union Committee bloc as was the steel industry. Coal in France was found chiefly in 2 areas, the northwest around Lille and the southeast around Lyons. The latter was controlled almost completely by the Union Committee bloc, but the Paribas influence was very great in the far richer northern area. It was these Paribas coal mines of the north which gradually drifted away and became one of the chief elements in monopolistic Lille-Lyons axis. The preponderant influence of the Union Committee bloc in such important fields as iron, steel, and coal was balanced to some extent by the skillful fashion in which the Paribas bloc had taken control of the strategic points in the field of communications and publicity. There were only 1,500 corporations registered on the stock exchange in Paris in 1936. Of this number, only about 600 were important. If we add to these about 150 or 200 important corporations not registered in Paris, we have a total of about 800 firms. Of these 800, the Paribas bloc controlled in 1936 almost 400, and the Union Committee bloc about 300. The rest were controlled by neither bloc. The superior numbers of firms controlled by Paribas was counterbalanced by the much heavier capitalization of the Union Committee firms. This, in turn, was counterbalanced by the fact that the Paribas firms were in strategic positions. The whole Paribas system in the 20th century was headed by Baron Edward de Rothschild, but the active head was René Meyer, manager of the Rothschild Bank and nephew by marriage of James Rothschild. The chief center of operations for the system was in the Banque de Paris des Paribas, which was managed until 1937 by the Horace family of Hungarian Jewish descent, brought to France by Rothschild in 1880. From this bank was ruled much of the section of the French economy controlled by this bloc. Included in this section were many foreign and colonial enterprises, utilities, shipbuilding, airlines, and above all, communications. In this latter group were C. Générale Transatlantique, C. Générale de Télégraphique Sans Fils, Radio France, C. Française des Câbles Télégraphiques, C. International des Wagons Havas, and Hachette. Havas was a great monopolistic news agency as well as the most important advertising agency in France. It could and did suppress or spread both news and advertising. It usually supplied news reports gratis to those papers which would print the advertising copy it also provided. It received secret subsidies from the government for almost a century, a fact first revealed by Balzac, and by the late 1930s, these subsidies from the secret funds of the Popular Front had reached a fantastic size. Hachette had a monopoly on the distribution of periodicals and a sizable portion of the distribution of books. This monopoly could be used to kill papers which were regarded as objectionable. This was done in the 1930s to François Coët's reactionary Les Amis des Peuples. After 1934, the Union Committee bloc was badly injured by the World Depression, which fell on heavy industry more severely than on other segments of the economy. After 1937, the Paribas bloc was badly split by the rise of anti-Semitism, the controversy over orthodox and unorthodox financial methods for dealing with the Depression, and, above all, by the growing foreign crisis. The Rothschild desire to form an alliance with Russia and adopt a policy of resistance to Hitler while supporting loyalist Spain, continuing orthodox financial policies, and building up the labor unions against the Comité des Forges collapsed from its own internal contradictions, their lack of faith in it, and the pressure of Great Britain. As the two older blocs thus weakened, a new bloc rose rapidly to power between them. This was the Lille-Lyons axis. It was constructed about two regional groups, one in the north about Lille, and the other, the southeast and east, about Lyons and Alsace. The former had a branch running to Brussels in Belgium, while the latter had a branch running to Basel in Switzerland. The Lille end was originally under Rothschild influence, while the Lyons end was originally under Mirabeau influence. The two ends were integrated into a single unit by the activities of several private banks and two deposit banks in Paris. The private banks included Odier, Sauteur et C, S. Popper at C, and Worms at C. The credit banks included the Crédit Commercial de France and the Banque Française pour le Commerce et Industrie. This Lille-Lyons axis was built up about four economic activities: electrical utilities, chemicals, artificial textiles, and light metals. These four were monopolistic and interrelated chiefly for technological reasons. They were monopolistic either by nature, public utilities, or because they were based on narrowly controlled natural resources, utilities, and chemicals, or because they required large-scale operation utilizing byproducts and affiliated activities for profitable operation, utilities, chemicals, artificial textiles, and light metals, or because they required use of closely held patents, chemicals, artificial textiles, and light metals. These activities were interrelated for various reasons. The public utilities of the North were based on coal, while those of the South East were based on water power. The manufacture of light metals concentrated in the Southeast because of the available water power. These metals, chiefly aluminum, were made by electrolysis, which provided chemical byproducts. Thus, The two light metal firms in France moved into the field of chemicals. The textile industry was already centered in the north about Lilly and in the southeast about Lyons. When this textile industry turned to artificial fibers, it had to ally with chemical firms. This was easy because the chemical firms of the southeast were already in close contact with the textile firms of Lyons, chiefly the Gillet family, while the chemical firms of the north were already in close contact with the textile firms of the area, chiefly the Mott family and its relatives. These textile firms of the north already controlled, in operation with Paribas, the richest coal mines of the area. These coal mines began to generate electric power at the mine, utilizing all byproducts for chemicals and artificial textiles. Since the textile families of the North, like Mott, were already related to the textile families of the Southeast, like Gillet, by marriage and by trade association, it was easy for the Lilly Lyons axis to grow up along these lines. As a result of the stalemate between the two great blocs, between financial capitalist and monopoly capitalist, between supporters of the Russian alliance and supporters of appeasement, between orthodox and unorthodox financial measures, between Jews and anti Semites, France was completely paralyzed and went down to defeat in 1940. This was quite acceptable to the Lilly Lyons axis. It accepted the defeat with satisfaction and, with German help, began to take over the whole economy of France. The Paribas bloc was destroyed by the anti-Semite laws, and many of its chief strong points were taken over. The Union Committee bloc was badly crippled by a series of severe blows, including the forced sale of all Schneider's foreign holdings and of most of Wendel's domestic holdings to the Germans, chiefly to Hermann Göring works. The seizure of other Lorraine iron properties, and the abolition of the Committee des Forges itself. At the same time, the Lilly Lyons axis strengthened itself. The French chemical industry, already largely monopolized by establishments Kuhlmann, was forced into a single corporation, Society Francoeur, controlled by the Lilly Lyons axis and I.G. Farben. The light metals industry, already largely monopolized by Alice Forges at Camargue, was centralized almost completely in this firm. The artificial textile industry, already largely monopolized by Gillet clique, was centralized under a single corporation, France Rayon, under a joint Gillet German control. The automobile industry was subjected to a single control, the Comité d'Organisation des Automobiles, and set up a joint manufacturing company, Société Générale Française de Construction Automobiles. The whole system was controlled by a small group in Lyons, centering about the Gillet family and represented on the political scene chiefly by Pierre Laval. The struggles between these great economic power blocs in France are rather difficult for Americans to understand because they were not reflected in price competition in the market where Americans would normally expect economic competition to appear. In the field of price policies, the three great blocs generally cooperated. They also cooperated in their attitudes towards labor, although to a lesser degree. Their rivalries appeared in the fields of economic and political power as struggles to control sources of raw materials, supplies of credit and capital, and the instruments of government. Price competition, which to an American always had seemed to be the first and even the only method of economic rivalry, has in Europe generally been regarded as the last possible method of economic rivalry, a method so mutually destructive as to be tacitly avoided by both sides. In fact, in France, as in most European countries, competing economic groups saw nothing inconsistent in joining together to use the power of the state to enforce joint policies of such groups toward prices and labor. The French defeat in 1940 shattered the stalemate between the economic power blocs which had paralyzed France in the 1930s and done so much to make the defeat possible. The two older blocs were disrupted under the German occupation and the Vichy regime. The Paribas bloc by the anti Semitic laws, and the Union Committee bloc because its holdings were desirable to the Germans and their French collaborators. The Lilly-Lyons axis, held by the associates of the Bank of Worms and the Banque de Indochine, sought to take over most of the French economy as the willing collaborators of the Germans and their old associate Pierre Laval, and were fairly successful in doing so, but the economic confusions of the occupation and the burden of German occupation cost made it impossible to win any significant benefits from their position. Moreover, as collaborators with the Nazis, the Lilly-Lyons axis could not expect to survive a German defeat and did not do so. The three pre-war blocs have played no significant role in France since 1945, although some of the personnel of Paribas have done so, notably René Meyer, active head of the Rothschild family interest, who was Minister of Finance in the early post-war government. Later, in 1962, de Gaulle made the director of the Rothschild Bank, Georges Pompidou, Prime Minister. The rather prominent role played by bankers such as these did not prevent France from following the pattern of new economic procedures which we have observed in other countries. The process was delayed by the political paralysis arising from the French parliamentary system, especially the inability of cabinets arising from the multiplicity of parties. The military crisis in Indochina, followed by the protracted and frustrating civil war in Algeria, prevented France from establishing any satisfactory economic system until 1958. The only achievement of the earlier period was, however, a very great one: the French role in establishing the European Common Market, which was decisive. This was established by the Treaty of Rome of 1957 with 6 members: France, West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and Luxembourg. It planned to remove the internal customs barriers among its members by stages over at least a dozen years, while adopting a common external tariff against outsiders. In this way, a mass market would be provided which would allow mass production with lower cost. France was unable to contribute much to this new market until its political instability was ended by the establishment of the Fifth Republic on a more authoritarian pattern in 1958. Constitution of October 4th. In December of that year, the franc was devalued and a program of fiscal austerity was inaugurated. At once, economic activity began to rise. The rate of growth of industrial production reached 6.3% in 1961 and almost 8.5% in 1962. The gold reserves doubled within 2 years of the devaluation. The resulting prosperity, called an economic miracle, in 1962 report of 29 Nation Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the successor organization to the Marshall Plan, was unevenly spread in that farmers and government employees obtained less than a fair share of it, and it was accompanied by the undesirable inflation of the cost of living, with 1953 as 100% to 103% in 1956 and up to 138% in 1961 and 144% in 1962. However, it brought France and the other common market countries to an unprecedented level of prosperity, which was in striking contrast to the drab conditions in the unfortunate countries within the Iron Curtain. The British, who had formed a European Free Trade Association of the Outer Seven, Austria, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Sweden, and Switzerland, to seek free trade among members but no common external tariff against others, sought to lift its rather lethargic economy by joining the common market in 1962, but it was rebuffed by de Gaulle, who required as a price that Britain renounce its efforts, going back over decades, to establish a special relationship with the United States. All right, we're on page 529. The United States of America, changing economic patterns. I don't think we're going to get through the whole section. I bet you can. The United States, which presents the most extreme example of financial capitalism, reached monopoly capitalism only in a partial and distorted fashion and for a very brief period, and has reached the following stage of the pluralist economy only in an unself-conscious and tentative way. From the beginning, the United States had a shortage of labor in the face of an unprecedented richness of resources. As a result, it sought labor-saving devices and high output per man day of work, even in agriculture. This means that the amount of capital equipment per man was unusually high throughout American history, even in the earliest period, and this undoubtedly represented a problem in an undeveloped country where private savings were, for many generations, scarce. The accumulation of such savings for investment in labor-saving mechanisms brought an opportunity to financial capitalism at an early date. Accordingly, the United States had financial capitalism over a longer period and in a more extreme form than any other country. Moreover, the size of the country made the problem of transportation so acute that the capital necessary for early canals, railroads, and iron industry was large and had to be found from sources other than local private persons. Much of it came from government subsidies or from foreign investors. It was observable as early as 1850 and had overseas connections which were still in existence in the 1930s. By the 1880s, the techniques of financial capitalism were well developed in New York and northern New Jersey and reached levels of corruption which were never approached in any European country, of course. This corruption sought to cheat the ordinary investor by flotations and manipulations of securities for the benefit of insiders. Success in this was its own justification, and the practitioners of these dishonesties were as socially acceptable as their wealth entitled them to be, without any any animadversions on how that wealth had been obtained. That sounds like New York to me. Corrupt techniques associated with the names of Daniel Drew or Jay Gould in the wildest days of railroad financial juggling were also practiced by Morgan and others who became respectable from longer sustained successes, which allowed them to build up established firms. Any reform of Wall Street practices came from pressure from the hinterlands, especially from the farming West, and was long delayed by the close alliance of Wall Street with the two major political parties, which grew up in 1880 to 1900. This alliance, by 1900, the influence of Morgan in the Republican Party was dominant, his chief rivalry coming from the influence of a monopoly capitalist, Rockefeller of Ohio. By 1900, Wall Street had largely abandoned the Democratic Party, a shift indicated by the passage of the Whitney family from the Democrats to the Republican inner circles shortly after they established a family alliance with Morgan. In the same period, the Rockefeller family reversed the ordinary direction of development by shifting from the monopoly fields of petroleum to New York banking circles by way of Chase National Bank. Soon, family as well as financial alliances grew up among the Morgans, Whitneys, and Rockefellers, chiefly through Payne and Aldrich family connections. For almost 50 years, from 1880 to 1930, financial capitalism approximated a feudal structure in which two great powers, centered in New York, dominated a number of lesser powers in both New York and in provincial cities. No description of the structure as it existed in the 1920s can be given in a brief compass, since it infiltrated all aspects of American life, and especially all branches of economic life. At the center were a group of less than a dozen investment banks, which were, at the height of their powers, still unincorporated private partnerships. These included J.P. Morgan, the Rockefeller family, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Dillon, Reed and Company, Brown Brothers, and Harriman, and others. Each of these was linked in organizational or perhaps relationships with various banks, insurance companies, railroads, utilities, and industrial firms. The result was to form a number of webs of economic power, of which the most important centered in New York, while other provincial groups allied with these were to be found in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, and Boston. J.P. Morgan worked in close relationship to a group of banks and insurance companies, including the First National Bank of New York, the Guarantee Trust Company, the Bankers Trust, the New York Trust Company, and Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. The whole nexus dominated a network of business firms which included at least 1/6 of the 200 largest non-financial corporations in American business. Among these were 12 utility companies, 5 or more railroad systems, 13 industrial firms, and at least 5 of the 50 largest banks in the country. The combined assets of these firms were more than $30 billion. They included American Telephone and Telegraph Company, International Telephone and Telegraph, Consolidated Gas of New York, the groups of electrical utilities known as Electrical Bond and Share, and as the United Corporation Group, which included Commonwealth and Southern Public Service of New Jersey, and Columbia Gas and Electric, the New York Central Railway System, the Van Schwergen Railway System of 9 lines, including Chesapeake and Ohio, Erie, Missouri, Pacific, the Nickel Plate, and the Perry Marquette, the Santa Fe, the Northern System of 5 Great Lines, the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Burlington, and others, the Southern Railway, General Electric Company, United States Steel, Phelps Dodge, Montgomery Ward, National Biscuit, Kennecott Copper, American Radiator and Standard Sanitary, Continental Oil, Reading Coal and Iron, Baldwin Locomotive, and others. The Rockefeller Group, which was really a monopoly capitalist organization investing only its own profits, functioned as a financial capitalist unit in close cooperation with Morgan. Allied with the country's largest bank, the Chase National, it was involved as an industrial power in the various Standard Oil firms and the Atlantic Refining Company, but it controlled over half the assets of the oil industry, plus the $2.33 billion assets in Chase National Bank. Kuhn Loeb was chiefly interested in railroads, where it dominated the Pennsylvania, the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the Milwaukee, the Chicago Northwestern, the Katy, Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad Company, and the Delaware and Hudson. It also dominated the Bank of Manhattan and the Western Union Telegraph Company for a total of almost $11 billion in assets. The Mellon Group, centered in Pittsburgh, dominated Gulf Oil, Coppers, Alcoa, Westinghouse Electric, Union Trust Company, the Mellon National Bank, Jones and Laughlin Steel, American Rolling Mill, Crucible Steel, and other firms for a total of about $3.3 billion. It has been calculated that the 200 largest non-financial corporations in the United States, plus the 50 largest banks in the mid-1930s, owned 34% of the assets of all industrial corporations, 48% of the assets of all commercial banks, 75% of all the assets of all public utilities, and 95% of the assets of all railroads. The total assets of all 4 classes were almost 100 billion, divided almost equally among the 4 classes. The 4 economic power blocks, which we have mentioned, Morgan, Rockefeller, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and Mellon, plus DuPont, and 3 local groups allied with these in Boston, Cleveland, and Chicago, together dominated the following percentages of 250 corporations considered here. Of industrial firms, 58% of their total assets, of railroads, 82%, of utilities, 58%. The aggregate value of these assets controlled by the 8 power groups was about $61,000 million of the total assets of $198,000 million in these 250 largest corporations at the end of 1935. The economic power represented by these figures is almost beyond imagination to grasp, and was increased by the active role which these financial titans took in politics. Morgan and Rockefeller together frequently dominated the National Republican Party, while Morgan occasionally had extensive influence in the National Democratic Party. 3 of the Morgan partners were usually Democrats. These 2 were also powerful on the state level, especially Morgan in New York and Rockefeller in Ohio. Mellon was a power in Pennsylvania, and DuPont was obviously a political power in Delaware. In the 1920s, this system of economic and political power formed a hierarchy headed by the Morgan interest and played a principal role in both political and business life. Morgan, operating on the international level in cooperation with his allies abroad, especially in England, influenced the events of history to a degree which cannot be specified in detail, but which certainly was tremendous. Nevertheless, the slow developments of business life which we have mentioned were making investment bankers like Morgan obsolete, and the deflationary financial policies on which these bankers insisted were laying the foundations of the economic collapse which ended their rule in general social disaster by 1940. The United States, however, the demise of financial capitalism, which was much more protracted than in most foreign countries and was not followed by a clearly established system of monopoly capitalism. This blurring of the stages was caused by a number of events, of which three should be mentioned. 1. The continued personal influence of many financiers and bankers even after their power had waned. 2. The decentralized condition of the United States itself, especially the federal political system. And 3. The long sustained political and legal tradition of anti monopoly going back at least to the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. As a consequence, the United States did not reach a clearly monopolistic economy and was unable to adopt a fully unorthodox financial policy capable of providing full use of resources. Unemployment, which had reached 13 million persons in 1933, was still at 10 million in 1940. On the other hand, the United States did not take long steps in the direction of balancing interest blocks by greatly strengthening labor and farm groups and by sharply curtailing the influence and privileges of finance and heavy industry. Of the diverse groups in the American economy, the financiers were most closely related to heavy industry because of the latter's great need for capital for its heavy equipment. The deflationary policies of the bankers were acceptable to heavy industry because the mass labor of heavy industry in the United States, notably in steel and automobile manufacturing, was not unionized, and the slowly declining prices of the products of heavy industry could not continue to be produced profitably if costs could be reduced by large-scale elimination of labor by installing more heavy equipment. Much of this new equipment, which led to assembly line techniques such as the continuous strip steel mill, were financed by the bankers. With unorganized labor, the employers of mass labor could rearrange, curtail, or terminate labor without notice on a daily basis and could thus reduce labor costs to meet falls in prices from bankers' deflation. The fact that reductions in wages or large layoffs in mass employment industries also reduce the volume of purchasing power in the economy as a whole to the injury of other groups selling consumers' goods was ignored by the makers of heavy producers' goods. In this way, farmers, light industry, real estate, commercial groups, and other segments of society were injured by the deflationary policies of the bankers and by the employment policies of heavy industry, closely allied with the bankers. When these policies became unbearable in the Depression of 1929 to 1933, these other interest blocs, who had been traditionally Republican, or at least, like the Western farmers, had refused to vote Democratic and had engaged in largely futile third-party movements, deserted the Republican Party, which remained subservient to high finance and heavy industry. This shift of the farm bloc, light industry, commercial interests, notably department stores, real estate, professional people, and mass, unskilled labor to the Democratic Party in 1932 resulted in the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal. The new administration sought to curtail the power of the two opposition and exploiting groups, bankers and heavy industry, and to reward and help the groups which had elected it. The farmers were helped by subsidies. Labor was helped by government spending to make jobs and provide purchasing power, and by encouragement of unionization, while real estate, professional people, and commercial groups were helped by the increasing demand from the increased purchasing power of farmers and labor. The New Deal's actions against finance and heavy industry were chiefly aimed at preventing these two from ever repeating their actions of the 1920s to 1933 period. The SEC Act sought to supervise securities issues and stock exchanges practices to protect investors. Railroad legislation sought to reduce the financial exploitation and even the deliberate bankruptcy of railroads by financial interest, such as William Rockefeller had done to the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, or as Morgan had done to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, train lines. The Banking Act of 1933 separated investment banking from deposit banking. The wholesale manipulation of labor by heavy industry was curtailed by the National Labor Relations Act of 1933, which sought to protect labor's rights of collective bargaining. At the same time, with the blessings of the new administration, a drive was made by labor groups allied with it to unionize the masses of unskilled labor employed by heavy industry to prevent the latter from adopting any policy of mass layoffs or sharp and sudden wage reductions in any future period of decreasing demand. To this end, a committee for industrial organization was set up under the leadership of the one head of the mass labor union in the country, John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers, and a drive was put on to organize the workers of the steel, automobile, electrical, and other industries which had no unions. All this served to create more highly organized and more self-conscious interest blocks in American life, especially among farmers and labor, but it did not represent any victory for unorthodox financing, the real key to either monopoly capitalism or to a managed pluralist economy. The reason for this was that the New Deal, because of President Roosevelt, was fundamentally orthodox in its ideas on the nature of money. Roosevelt was quite willing to unbalance the budget and to spend in a depression in an unorthodox fashion because he had grasped the idea that lack of purchasing power was the cause of a lack of demand, which made unsold goods and unemployment, but he had no idea of the causes of the depression and had quite orthodox ideas on the nature of money. As a result, his administration treated the symptoms rather than the causes of the depression, and while spending unorthodoxly to treat these symptoms, did so with money borrowed from the banks in the accepted fashion. The New Deal allowed the bankers to create money, borrowed it from the banks, and spent it. This meant that the New Deal ran up the national debt to the credit of the banks and spent money in such a limited fashion that no drastic reemployment of idle resources was possible. One of the most significant facts about the New Deal was its orthodoxy on money. For the whole 12 years he was in the White House, Roosevelt had statutory power to issue fiat money in the form of greenbacks printed by the government without recourse to the banks. This authority was never used. As a result of such orthodoxy, the Depression's symptoms of idle resources were overcome only when the emergency of the war in 1942 made it possible to justify a limitless increase in the national debt by limitless borrowing from private persons and the banks. But the whole episode showed a failure to grasp the nature of money and the function of the monetary system, of which considerable traces remained in the post war period. One reason for the New Deal's readiness to continue with an orthodox theory of the nature of money, along with an unorthodox practice in its use, arose from the failure of the Roosevelt administration to recognize the nature of the economic crisis itself. This failure can be seen in Roosevelt's theory of pump priming. He sincerely believed, as did his Secretary of the Treasury, that there was nothing structurally wrong with the economy, that it was simply temporarily stalled and would keep going of its own powers if it could be restarted. In order to restart it, all that was needed, in New Deal theory, was a relatively moderate amount of government spending on a temporary basis. This would create purchasing power, demand for consumer goods, which in turn would increase the confidence of investors who would begin to release large, unused savings into investment. This would, again, create additional purchasing power and demand, and the economic system would take off of its own power. The curtailment of the powers of finance and heavy industry would then prevent any repetition of the collapse of 1929. The inadequacy of this theory of the Depression was shown in 1937 when the New Deal, after 4 years of pump priming and a victorious election of 1936, stopped its spending. Instead of taking off, the economy collapsed in the steepest recession in history. The New Deal had to resume its treatment of symptoms, but now without hope that the spending program could ever be ended, a hopeless prospect since the administration lacked the knowledge of how to reform the system or even how to escape from borrowing bank credit with its mounting public debt, and the administration lacked the courage to adopt the really large-scale spending necessary to give full employment of resources. The administration was saved from this impasse by the need for the rearmament program followed the war. Since 1947, the Cold War and the space program have allowed the same situation to continue, so that even today prosperity is not the result of a properly organized economic system, but of government spending, and any drastic reduction in such spending would give rise to an acute depression. So there you go. They can't stop spending money. They can't stop printing money. So I'm going to stop right there. The next section is economic factors. It's on page 535. Link to the PDF for this is in the description below. Also, check out Anarchapulco. I think it's in February. So, not really much to say about that. But you can see how after they did the New Deal, that's basically where we're at now, where it's like this welfare state, where the only way they can keep the economy going is by making more stuff for the military and handing out welfare, because obviously the wages don't cover the standard of living, don't cover how much money everything costs. So it's like the balance of that is completely lost. Anyway, I'm going to get out of here with that. Thanks for watching the video if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear that. So have a good day and peace.